We've got a new comic book at the printer this week called The Ballad of Gia Frankie, and that's exactly what we're going to discuss on This Week in Talking Comics. We're also going to talk about some really great wrestling comics and why you should read more wrestling comics. Ooh, yeah! What is up, Legacy Comics universe? Patrick Hickey Jr. here. I almost forgot my name for a second. It's been a long week. Patrick Hickey Jr. here, editor-in-chief of Legacy Comics. I have been in the comic book industry for a couple of years now. I write the Condry series, the Job series, which happens to be a wrestling comic, as well as Kroom, Brooklyn Bleeds. I edit all of our books at Legacy Comics. I'm also a 7-time author of the minds behind the game's video game book series, Big Pop Culture Geek. I'm also a voice actor starring in games like The Padre, BPM Boy, and the upcoming WrestleQuest from Megacat Studio. So that's a little bit about me. That's why you should kind of try and listen to the things that I'm saying. I've also been a college professor for 17 years, so at the City University of New York. I love to educate, love pop culture. So this week out in Talking Comics, we're going to discuss one of our newest books, which is The Ballad of Gia and Frankie, which is written by John Ambrose, Justin Cardullo, and myself. We'll discuss my role in that quite shortly, and illustrated by the illustrious, the prosperous, the awesomeness that is Joshua Adams. So if you guys follow any of our books, you know that Joshua Adams is the artist on Sarita, as well as Dem Goals and Godfo. Love working with him. He's a big-time wrestling fan, as well as I am. Like I've told you guys before in other podcasts, I have interviewed hundreds of professional wrestlers over my 17 years as a journalist. Love, love, love professional wrestling. Love the stories that are told in professional wrestling. So, as my dog barks in the background for some reason. So anyway, I guess he's excited about another wrestling book from Legacy Comics as well. But anyway, how did The Ballad of Gia and Frankie come to be? Well, The Ballad of Gia and Frankie has a lot to do with the origin of Legacy Comics. So while we were building our Kickstarter, I pitched several newspapers, television stations, websites, and I got us a ton of promotion. I basically kind of cashed every favor in that was owed to me. And I reached out to a Brooklyn television station, News 12, and they came to former co-owner of Legacy Comics, John Svedesi's house, and they spoke to us about our Kickstarter and what we were doing. And they focused a little bit too much on Renfield Visions of Madness, which was fine. It was pretty cool that we did a Dracula book, like, kind of right out of the gate, and that we had the, blessing of the Bram Stoker estate. But we were trying to, kind of pitch them everything that we were doing. And everything that we were doing was Kroom, The Job, at the time, Athos, Condry, Legend of the Night Owl. That didn't happen. But it did show that we were incredibly hardworking. So fast forward maybe 4 months later, and now we're kind of in June of 2022, and I get an email. I'm not sure, I don't remember if it was Justin or if it was John, but they basically said that they saw the TV spot and they were interested in working with us, and they sent me a link to their documentary, which happened to be The Ballad of Gia and Frankie. So being a big-time wrestling fan, I eat up wrestling documentaries. Beyond the Mat, The Resurrection of Jake the Snake Roberts. Have tons and tons of WWE behind-the-scenes DVDs. Like I said, I've interviewed tons of wrestlers. I speak to wrestlers quite often about what they do in the ring. I've helped wrestlers with their movesets. There's tons and tons of stuff that I've done, over the years with professional wrestling. Behind the scenes kind of stuff, fun stuff, like I said, now I'm the lead voice actor on WrestleQuest. So, I love pro wrestling. Any way that I can be involved, I will offer my services. So anyway, watch this wrestling documentary, and as a comic book publisher, the first thing that I say to myself is, this will be an excellent comic. If we put the right artist on this that we have, this can be a great, great comic. I'm totally down with this as like an ash can, like an 8-page proof of concept story that kind of like teases the documentary, gets people interested and stuff. However, my co-owner at the time, John Svedesi, was like absolutely not, wasn't a fan of the documentary, didn't want to do another wrestling book because we already had the job. If you guys have listened to episode 4, I talk about all about the origin of the job, which it basically started off as a play, and it was then a pitch project to lesser known comics after COVID, because obviously they weren't doing any plays in the middle of COVID, and lesser known comics was basically like just focus on Condry. So that was kind of like the writing on the wall. The job was going to get greenlit at Legacy. I believed in it. So anyway, he's like, we already have the job. We're not doing another wrestling book. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I speak to Justin and John, and I'm like, just kind of feeling them out. And they're like, they want to have a meeting. So I go to John. I'm like, they want to have a meeting. And he goes, whoa, don't want to do a book. Don't want to do a wrestling book. And I'm like, you never say no to the meeting. So, and I want this podcast to kind of be like a behind the scenes of like Legacy. I want it to be a history lesson on wrestling books, which I'm going to get into. I'm going to discuss some really great wrestling books if you're into wrestling books. But I also want it to be like me imparting some of my wisdom, things that I've learned through my interviews with the minds behind the games, talking to extremely successful video game developers, me interviewing professional wrestlers that are, transcend pro wrestling and that have success in the business world, my experiences with CEOs and executives that have been kind enough to like lend me their ear and let me bounce ideas off of them. So what I've learned in my, 21 years as an adult after the age of 18. And what I've learned as someone that's run a website that's been somewhat successful, it turns a profit every year, reviewfix.com, and a comic book company that's doing okay, that's doing solid, is you never say no to a meeting. If someone wants to meet with you, it means at the very least they're interested in investing in you, investing money. But the meeting is an investment of time. And a lot of the time is more important than the meeting. The things that they say, it's called like social currency. It's also called building an acumen for your worth. So I'm basically like, let's have the meeting. Let's see what they're interested in doing. So we have the meeting. And it's so funny. I'm watching John's face as the meeting goes on, and it's just, he loves these guys. He loves them. And I know right off the bat that John Ambrose is somebody that I definitely want to work with. He's smart. He knows what he wants to accomplish here. And he's focused. And Justin is mega passionate and super focused as well. And not scared to work. So we get off the meeting. And everything like kind of goes super well. Well, not kind of goes. It goes super well. And we're going to kind of like see what happens. And we get off the Zoom, and I look at John and I'm like, see? And he goes, yeah, that worked out good. And I'm like, see? And you didn't even want to have the meeting with them. And I've told John and Justin this story. It's something that I felt like I should share with you guys, to just share an experience that like you never say no to the meeting. If someone wants to invest in you and someone is interested in what you do, you share an experience with them. You let them know like what you do, why you do it, and you never know what can happen. So in this situation, it basically greenlit the Ballad of Gia Frankie. So if you guys don't know, the Ballad of Gia Frankie is about a wrestler, Justin Cardulo. It's based on his life. He's also a co-writer, and how it's kind of a coming of age story of how he starts in professional wrestling and how he finishes in pro wrestling. And also along the way, a pretty crazy story that happens to him along the way. Someone from his past gets involved, and it's kind of almost like too strange to be true, but it is. And I love what we're able to accomplish in 8 pages. So if you haven't pre-ordered it, if you're listening to it now and you're interested, you'll like it. The story is solid, and we'll get into the story a little bit more too as we go on. But from that minute on, after that meeting, I knew we were going to do a comic with them, and I was excited. So now after this, we're like, who are we going to put on this book? And there was some other stuff going on at Legacy behind the scenes, and what ultimately ended up happening before we assigned an artist onto this book, John left the company. So John leaves the company, and now I'm in charge of everything. I go from co-owner to sole owner the day before my 39th birthday, and I assign Joshua Adams to do the art on this book. And the reason why I assigned Joshua Adams is because he wasn't working on anything at the moment. He did an Ashcan for us, the Godfall universe. He did, which is going to be a graphic novel at some point. Those guys are working hard on it, and it's so funny. I'm about to talk about Steve Conjay, and he's sending me panels. He's texting me panels as we speak. This is one of the hardest working guys in comics. But anyway, Josh had just finished Dem Goals. He had finished Godfall, and I knew he was working on the graphic novel, but he was somebody that I knew that in a pinch could deliver top-notch art, really good turnaround time, and he loved wrestling, so it was like a perfect fit. So we put him on, and he starts working on the art. So good. So good. So much fun to work with him. If you give him a script, he's really adept at asking questions and bringing the finer points out in your script. He understands that I'm a fan of wide open panels or panels with eloquent distribution. So we're talking somebody that I'd love to work with is like a Will's Portaccio, where there's stuff going on behind the panels that you have to look at, but then the way the panels are structured, it forces the eye to wander around the page, meaning like every time you look at the art, it kind of can touch you in a different way. So I'm like, Josh is the perfect person to take an 8-page script here and really make it feel like more than the sum of its parts. And that's exactly what he did here. So I was super happy that he worked on it. There was a whole bunch of little elements that he added to the book that made it special. However, before we got to the art that Josh killed, his cover is amazing. The variant cover by Valentin Quinones is an homage to one of my favorite runs of all time, the Chris Claremont, Frank Miller Wolverine run, which has been done. People have done their homage to it, but I don't think there's ever been an homage quite like this one. So it's really cool. So art-wise, we were covered. I knew I was gonna get us a really kick-ass variant cover, and I knew that Josh was gonna be able to handle the sequentials and his cover beautifully. We were fine. But before we got to that, we had to go over the script. And it being their first comic book script, I had no intention of putting my name on the book. It was my job to edit. And then we had several really good rundowns of their script. And I just, as we moved through the process, I found myself working extremely well with John Ambrose. Just kind of being like, all right, you want to say this, but why don't you say this instead? Or what, instead of saying this, you should say this. And then we start going over the script a lot, and it's starting to feel a lot more like a Patrick Hickey script than it would if I just had edited it. Because, I mean, if you read The Legend of the Night Owl, there's definitely parts of Afram's writing that I have stuck my nose in a little bit and tightened. And Afram's great to work with, and he gets it. It's just me trying to bring out Afram's finer points. And in this case, I was bringing out Justin and John's finer points, but I felt like I was tightening more than I would with somebody else's book, which is fine because it was their first script, and they understood that. So by the time that we were done, I was like, guys, I think I deserve a writing credit on this. And they were like, yeah, we think you do too. And it was a really good experience working with them. So once we were able to do that, then we handled the art. And an ashcan is essentially like a proof of concept, so you've got to make like every page hit hard, and I feel like Joshua Adams does an awesome job of making every page count, and he builds off of a extremely tight script. A script where like every sentence counts, every word counts, there's no wasted space. And that's not to say that it was like that before, but it was kind of like there was definitely some parts that strayed from that coming of age, almost like gritty noir kind of take on someone that was finding themselves in pro wrestling. So I felt like my edits helped capture that, and then I feel like I honestly made John Ambrose and Justin Cardullo better, because then they were suggesting edits to my stuff and then edits to their stuff. So they went from being completely comic book newbies to something completely different by the end. Like these guys know how to write a comic book script now, which is really cool to have educated them and to see their growth as writers from June to, February. It's a lot. These guys have grown a lot. They took a lot of criticism. They took a lot of critique, and they grew from it. So that was a lot of fun. So the end result is a pretty damn cool wrestling comic. So what I wanted to talk about too in this, aside from, like I said, teasing it and saying it's available for pre-order, we've got 2 different covers and stuff, is that we're not the wrestling publisher, despite the fact that we have 2 wrestling comics, The Job and The Ballad of Gia Frankie. And you know what? If a story came along and it happened to be about wrestling and it was great, I'd publish it too. Because I definitely feel that there is an avenue for wrestling comics. And there are tons of wrestling publishers out there. There's like Headlocked Comics. There's a whole bunch of publishers out there that just do sports and like wrestling comics, and they do super well for themselves. And every time I'm at a con, I see them there, and they get like Hangman Page, and they get, Darren McCarty, and they get these great professional athletes and wrestlers to tell their story. Sergeant Slaughter. So there's definitely a place for comics based on pro wrestling, nonfiction. See, but my thing is, and like, if I had to name my favorite nonfiction wrestling comic, it would be Andre the Giant: Life and Legend by Box Brown. If you guys have never read that before, Box Brown, in the words of Rob Liefeld, a word he uses all the time, seminal. He's a seminal talent, Box Brown. He's got an amazing graphic novel on the history of Tetris, the video game, and the creator. It's awesome. But what he's able to do with Andre the Giant, if you don't like wrestling and you just like biographies, you'll love it. If you love wrestling, you will adore Life and Legend, Andre the Giant. Super, super solid. But there, like I said, that's nonfiction pro wrestling comics. There's actually a slew of super solid fiction wrestling comics. And I'm not talking about the Ultimate Warrior and his sentient tassels from the late 80s and early 90s, even though that book had some pretty slamming art. I'm talking about Invasion from WrestleTopia. Really freaking cool fiction wrestling comic set in, this magical world and stuff. It's really cool. Totally suggest checking it out. Those guys have a deep background in the video game industry as well. However, there's a book called Do a Powerbomb by Image Comics right now that is one of the best books in, I would say, the past 2 or 3 years. Definitely coming of age. It's got some lucha feel to it, but like the art in that book is so beautiful. The colors, the lines and the characters, like you see every punch, every kick, every slap, every suplex, every Frankensteiner, every Hurricane Rana. Like, it really brings the in-ring action alive, but then it also tells a great story about people. And I think that's what a lot of people that are not into pro wrestling think. It's just a bunch of sweaty men and women on top of each other, throwing each other around. But usually it's the stories that get people hooked, and then it's the in-ring action that they fall in love with after. For me, I'm more of a fan of the in-ring action than I am the stories, but when you get a great story, it just heightens everything, like kind of like what's going on right now with Sami Zayn and the Bloodline. That stuff is just top notch, and it makes the in-ring action matter that much more. However, as much as I love Do a Powerbomb, as much as I think Invasion from WrestleTopia is cool, and as much as I adore Life and Legend, the Andre the Giant story from Box Brown, the best wrestling comic that I have ever read is actually an indie comic, and it's called Heat by Jeff Martin. I interviewed Jeff, I would say, in like 2009 or 2010. I met him on Twitter. I'm pretty sure someone introduced me to him. And I'm going to just read a piece of my review from... Oh, it's from 2011, I'm sorry. November 14th, 2011. So we're talking, this is almost 13 years ago. Okay? An independent graphic novel about a pro wrestler in space set in the year 3000. It's in black and white too. It's a compilation of comic strips as well. With these three elements striking a chord as either strange or associated with usually weak work, Jeff Martin's Heat may be a trade you'll originally pass up, but that would be a huge mistake. For those that grew up on a heavy diet of WWE as a kid, the thought of watching Dick the Bastard, yes, the main character's name is Dick the Bastard, fight his way from jobber to main eventer is something both familiar and fun. In the end, however, Martin does more than cash in on pop culture sensibilities. He crafts a one-of-a-kind story that is also infectiously drawn and features two characters that you can listen to forever. You'd never expect this book to be a futuristic buddy comedy, but that's exactly what it becomes. Confused? Think Nintendo's Punch-Out meets South Park with a Calvin and Hobbes look. Man, this book, like, totally rocked me to my core. It's got no color. It's in black and white. The lettering is by hand. I'm pretty sure it's by hand. But it's just got something. It's just got something. And that something is infectious characters telling an infectious story. And I'm going to tell you, if I don't read this book, there's a chance that The Job never exists. And that's not to say that I copied, because my book is completely different than this. My book is about a couple finding their way through professional wrestling. It's not set in the year 3000. There's no space jail. There's none of this other stuff. It's not in black and white. Steve Conjay definitely doesn't draw like Calvin and Hobbes. Neither does Kieran X. Quinn. But the focus on character and making each character in the story not feel like a stereotype and not feel like someone that's easily forgotten, that was something that, like, I strove for when I was writing The Job, and it's something that was always in the back of my mind when I was reading the script for The Ballad of Gia and Frankie. At every single step of the way, I'm like, how do we make Gia Savitz somebody that we care about? How do we make Justin's character in the beginning, the Nomad, a character that we care about? How do we make Frankie Firestarter, like the main protagonist, a character that matters? How do we do that? And the reason why is because Jeff does an amazing job of making every character be able to tell a story and tell a story their way and make it feel like that, despite the, and I don't want to say overtly simplistic, and I don't want to say boring art, because it's not boring. I love everything about the art in this book. So I knew with an artist the caliber of Joshua Adams that I would be able to tell a story with some staying power, and the script really lent itself to like a coming of age story. So I'm super happy with what we did with The Ballad of Gia and Frankie. But like I have to say is, anyone that thinks that they could pass this book up because it's about wrestling, it is rooted in the creative process of some of the greatest wrestling comics of all time that I have read, that I have interviewed the authors and the artists, Box Brown and Jeff Martin, and that I appreciate, like Planet WrestleTopia. I've interviewed that team as well. So when you have somebody that loves wrestling, that has interviewed some of the greatest people to ever write wrestling books, and is working with people as passionate as Justin Cardullo, as John Ambrose, and Joshua Adams, you're gonna get something special. So again, super happy with the way the book turned out, and I hope that you guys check out all of the books that I've mentioned today. Because if you check out all of these books, then you're going to see that like there's so much more on the bone when it comes to pro wrestling comic books. It's so easy to be like, oh, WWE puts out these like crappy, wrestling books that are just like biographies of the characters. A lot of the art, guys, a lot of the art in those books is awesome. Have you seen the Seth Rollins comic? Have you seen the Ric Flair comic? The art is fantastic. If you don't know anything about Seth Rollins and Ric Flair, if you read the comic, you get connected to them more than ever. So it's hard when you have licensed material, because if you see a comic book that's based on a movie, you go, why do I need to read the comic? And the thing is, if you really love the source material, you're gonna want to check out the comic. So my whole thing is, the thing that I like the most about the Gia and Frankie comic is that it'll make you want to watch the documentary if you haven't seen it yet. And then if you've seen the documentary, we fill in some gaps in the documentary that aren't there. So it's just like they just work beautifully hand in hand. So again, read the Ballad of Gia and Frankie. By the time this podcast airs, it'll be available on our website, on our shop. And then also, like I said, man, check out Heat by Jeff Martin. Check out Do a Powerbomb. There's just so much great wrestling stuff out there to get a hold of. And as I say this, like I said, Steve Conjay has been sending me art for the past like half hour. The Job 2 is on the way too. So if you like those wrestling comics, we're going to continue to deliver those. So stay tuned.